Hi, thank you for the introduction. I'm so excited to be following with Jasmine because this definitely follows up on a lot of the points that she brought up. Um, Here is the beginning of a performance about beginnings. Like many others, I was drawn to technology because it allowed me to make and unmake myself. A bit about me to begin. I grew up in Manila, Philippines, and only moved to the United States for college, which was about 5 years ago. Much of my life was radically transformed by technology, not because of the technology itself, but rather because it enabled me to think of where I could be and how I could bring myself there. I literally like grew up in like Philippine internet cafes, paying like 20 cents an hour to get internet access and snuck here after school to like make websites and play League of Legends. So that was my early life. For the past decade, I've worked with thousands of technologists in the Philippines with Develop, a nonprofit and collective I founded in 2016. Our interest we describe today is in reclaiming technology as a tool for liberation rather than that of oppression. Our programming has impacted millions of Filipinos across national elections and crises. We've worked deeply with cultural and educational institutions to publish and rethink alternative models of looking at computing within the country. Today, I practice as an internet and ambient artist, which is another way of saying I work a product design day job and go to experimental music shows. Much of this practice is an interest in placemaking, labor, influenced by my upbringing and these constant redefinitions of what it means to be a technologist. The drastically in different environments I was raised in the Philippines against now living in the Bay Area and as a tech worker, constantly struggling with this identity that feels at odds with how I grew up. I've indexed myself since 2009 on my personal site, Chia.design, which I will tab switch to pretty awkwardly. Um, but you can literally like see like bits of sites I made them since I was like 9 years old. And in ways, this is because the web has served as one of the most reliable ways to make sense of my many selves across the lives I've lived. And if you want more proof that I love indexing myself on the web, you can find me at all of these URLs. These days, I'm increasingly interested in how the story of the internet is the story of people and how to get people to be better stewards of this history, their history at the individual and collective level. This is the beginning of an attempt to make sense of how I and the people I've loved have been existing with technology. Partly sacrilegious, partly over-optimistic, perhaps a bit of a naive naming. In other words, I'm telling a story about myself to see the small life I've lived and trusting that it may be extended here in some form. So think of this talk as a little performance, a little reading. The web afforded me the most agency in its making. It was the medium in which I was most easily able to navigate all the overlapping, intersecting worlds around me, a pluriversal world, as you may. I understood the worlds I was existing in, even cursorily enough to begin understanding the composite characteristics of what makes a world. I could begin to identify myself, me as a condition of the environments and technologies around me, learning how to move within them. Then I made worlds. First, I was perhaps absorbed by the technology of the alphabet as a child beginning to speak. What I saw, I then spoke from. This cognitive technology around how I think, how I talk with you all today. I then absorbed prayer and practiced ritual. In bearing faith, I became what others had faith in, belief, extending belief. I learned that you did not have to see something to speak for it. Around me, it felt that commandments became kind of like stringent rules for how to be. Rejection meant exclusion from the only world I knew. Unlike orality, things here were more fixed, uniform, dictated the way of being, dominated the way of looking. Every home I found myself in had people who believed, further reinforced through constant ritual, process, gathering, whatever you would like to term it. I thought this must be the only way of being, or I didn't know how to imagine a way of being that would let me be with my loved ones without it. Feels like I struggled more with laws than the process of faith in itself. I could not perceive these alternate ways of being amidst the environments around me. I then looked at the screen. Computer must have rewired something. I realized that I could translate what I held in my head into something materially real. There was a name for what I had been struggling to define. Suddenly, a space of queerness and chaos and affirmation of the self, I realized an alternative to the only worlds I was taught to live within. Specifically, I was drawn towards websites. It's nothing radical or intensive, especially in the time in which I encountered them, like late 2000s. But they were to me these infinitely sprawling canvases that challenged the range of known expression I had that was taught to me. Suddenly, I was in this space where I could represent myself, save myself. I was suddenly interacting with multiple worlds at once, with people and ideas that were never before presented to me, engaging in an overwhelming amount of multitudes of paths that I could take. I selected which of these I could take and live the most. I extend the web as an example of one of the technologies I speak kind of vaguely about here, of the many contemporary technologies that speakers across the conference might allude to. It's a malleable one, intentionally so, wherein I recognize that the web, the internet, as we know it, may end, and some new technology, a protocol for what I found in it, will emerge after today. Instead of needing the backing of institutions or people to modify the world I needed, I realized that the institutions and people before me had given me the tools to make my own worlds. I had also understood the blind power of faith and was given this dangerous power of being able to make what I believed in, particularly in believing that my vision was necessary enough to make. I knew before I knew that the pursuit of machines was more about the pursuit of being. Ursula Le Guin describes that the principal interest in science fiction isn't that of engineering. Rather, it is about how minds, societies, cultures work. How can anybody tell a story about the future without describing implicitly or explicitly its technology, after all? It's an impossible task. The story of people is the story of technology, how we've shaped it, how we live with it, believe in it, commune with one another through it. I think we're all praying in hopes of a way of being, this subject of prayer, always one beyond objecthood. It is an addressal. In religious texts that I grew up with, perhaps the source of the divine was through these prayers and miracles we passed on to each other. Today, instead, is the computer that fronts these many gods of computation, the artifacts that extended or ways of being become the machine. As we are aware that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, once the unexplainable things of the world were ascribed to divinity, then the machines came, and it appeared that the transcendence was accessible every day. While some of us may know and understand the inner workings of them, I think many of the common masses accept the invisibility of machines, only noticing them when they fail us or begin to work against us. We live in a world where what is revered as divine is always shifting. I think the reality of the thing is that everyone also wants to be God. I wanted to be one too. Perhaps I was failed by the idea of God in the existing world I was navigating, and was fascinated by alternate mythologies that helped me question these old systems of belief, particularly in understanding that something did not have to be real for you to pray to it, particularly in knowing that belief itself still has a convoluted definition, that there's this like necessary delusion in the process of making us well. It's inherent to it. It's inherent to anyone who makes. I understood that before anything could become real, there must first be belief. So I believed in the computer of all things I could choose to believe in. Then the computer became something of an instrument to which I poured this belief in, which in turn made me believe that I could become some god myself. There must have been a human that made the device that allowed me to attain this small form of godhood. First, the light that allowed me to see beyond my immediate vicinity, and then the light that allowed me to direct light itself. We know that today the technologist wields this contemporary form of magic, but this talk I try is not about the tired realization that creation is worlding, is a responsibility that we all bear. We all know this, but instead is more about what kind of underlies the ability to dictate reality. I think the faith that we place in technology is the faith that we place in people. The utilities we use, the structures that allow our creation, the history of tools that led to other tools that we then use to begin shaping worlds. I think the beautiful part about technology is that it always returns to the story of humans. It's always about influencing the narrative of human experience. This is why we live in the world that gods have set for us. We trust the narratives they imagined for us, and they produce technologies or means that allow this living to become real, material, for us to actually feel them. This is why people believe in the first place. I think the root of invention is in faith. I think science and technology, as contentious as this belief might be, are irrevocably attuned with theology, however you may read it. We are social reality and science fiction all at once. What we believe in grounds experience. What we believed in was made. I think to invest in someone's act of invention is almost, if not an act of like spirituality. If there's any form of spirituality ascribed to it, must be one of people, of trusting in the vision of the future, take the object that catalyzes this vision of the future and live through it. We're all environments, ecologies of what we believe in, use, love. We are our technologies, infrastructures of one another. I think also what defines humanity is our interdependency with artifacts. We are constantly transformed by technologies and constant redefinition of ourselves with them. And in turn, we all ourselves have potential to be God, to believe in something, to will something in existence, to change the possible existence from another. This is the gift of the technologist, a gift whose weight and responsibility we must be acutely aware of. The world is a mass of machines. It is easy to look at the emerging and the future. It is much harder to identify what technologies are already embedded into the fabric of our society, into our everyday. All around us is someone's life's work. It's up to us to better identify this, understand what has gone into the making of our own beginnings. And while the makers of machines are gods here, and while in theory everyone has the potential to be God, I think we're far from a time where the prerequisites of godhood are knowable to the masses. So what now when what is thinkable is shaped by the machine, when what is thinkable more accurately is shaped by the creators of machines? This is part 2 about mythology, power, and falsehoods. So it goes that the history of people is the history of technology. Our bodies are merged with our artifacts as the question of technological embodiment, however we define it, arises. Technologies call us to constantly redefine ourselves as we redefine these objects. Technology itself might be more human than the human. I'm less interested in these undrawable lines between where we end and our technologies begin. I don't think it's useful to try and think of an answer to that. I think I'm more invested in how we've begun letting these technologies define us in the first place. It goes that this is the question of faith. I think our engagement with technology, like that of our engagement with the known world, is built atop of mythology. I define mythology here as the amalgamation of narratives that coalesce into some symbolic, thematic account of a beginning, of an explanation to all this. I turn to mythology above history here because the beliefs that respond to the technological promise provide more than the non-existent, true chronological record when attempting to understand our communion with the world. A linear one may not exist, individually or collectively. I don't mean to reject truth or history, definitely not so. I mean I separate those questions of history and truth from mythology. Truth was never a prerequisite of faith. Like with the many cosmogonical myths we pass along to make sense of the origins of the universe, the nature of the digital creation myth is pluriversal. We are fragmented across technologies, each with different groups of adherents, maybe at odds with each other, with those who believe, able to also hold belief in conflict with one another. We traverse many possible ways of being at once, this part of the magic of being in communion with technology. This is how we live amongst it. We live with a modern creation myth. There was a creator and the machine that was created. There was the machine and what it made us. Our modern world entrusts the technologist to dictate the natural through the machine. There was the story of what people could be and the machine that let this be. For all, the body itself is only human by virtue of technology. The creation myths of technology do not necessarily need to explain the beginnings of the earth. We become explicitly human through what machines afford us, through the redefined human that emerges. The origin story of the modern human is the origin story of technologies, not solely of the earth. These creation myths only need to provide the foundations for the technologies they seek to explain. The stories may exist on top of one another, operating on top of their pre-existing material. Perhaps the earth, the waters, the rocks were already there. New creation myths emerge ceaselessly as we explain new technologies atop of the old, as we continue attempting to explain ourselves. Barthes considers mythology to be a type of speech. The roots of mythology come from speech, narrative, myth, plot, kind of obvious. The stories that concern people, the natural and social, especially those of the supernatural. There's no sense of objecthood or truth necessary here. There is only what we say and the history of what it builds upon and how this makes what we deem to be history. or mythology in itself. Because myth is not in some object or truth, but in how it is uttered, mythologies accompany technologies in their promise. There's always this like return to faith. I think many different technologies have their own sense of discourse. The technology of the silk against the machine carries different readings. We do these kind of shameful categorizations of certain objects as low or high technologies. Before the information age, who could have known what was high? Was it fire? Was it prayer? Was it words? What people consider to be the most powerful, the objects of myth, are the ones that are rendered invisible, inexplicable. These are therefore magical, the ones that are divine. Mythologies then must make a world, for worlds must be constantly affirmed by this way of inhabitation, this way we reaffirm what is natural, what we believe in. The people who dwell within the world concretizes the boundaries and laws through these words and actions, kind of a transfiguration of the environment through the simple power inlaid with humans to orient ourselves in places and declare meaning where there was none. An easy reading of what I might mean with like digital mythology is the tired narratives of the visionary founder. They identify problems and have a computational solution, perhaps ones that usually favor performance, scale, reach, presenting solutions through these palatable narratives that maybe oversimplify the complexities of what they target, because this makes the narrative they preach believable. This makes what they say more powerful. In fact, many cosmogonical like creation myths, despite evidence against and with all their internal contradictions, they're still subscribed to. Faith does not need truth. Again, where it leads us is more valuable. But what is the lived reality that emerges? I question. The concern of the creation myth is not often that of root cause or first principles, but rather contesting one way of being in the world and instead just presenting another. It is easier to rush into the story. Another reading is through the many who are already constructing minor worlds amidst transgressive technologies, perhaps subverting the original intentions of the technologies they dwell between. There might always be this distance between gods and people. This is what kind of delineates the common man from the god in the first place. I think that these small places already found in alcoves, like the YouTube comments. I made a website like representing this called The Sound of Love. Just fascinated by how people are so frighteningly human where you'd think they wouldn't be at all. Mythology already exists within tightly knit internet communities and subcultures. I'm sure we are tired of the word lore, which I use here to refer to smaller and more localized forms of tradition. They are present everywhere in niche subreddits and forums, fandoms with complex relationships and interjections against their canons. In memes, they are rewriting themselves. They're making their own worlds, separate from what is truth. I'm sure we're tired of this word to describe a guy's Substack plus Discord server, but it extends to really a way in which we can name like all the small communities around us, these smaller forms of mythologization that already occur, where these small worlds begin intersecting with ours, where confusing TikTok lexicon permeates ours for us to only marginally understand through the retellings of a YouTube video essay or an internet culture reporter. The time they reach these people, the transference across worlds perhaps dilutes the once sacred context of the inner world, of the originating world. After it has reached the tweet, its original meaning is perhaps dead. New one emerges. Hyper-specificity, also the death of a reference, the inside, the signifiers imbued with meanings to rationalize unto the new world, perhaps one far more uncool. We inhabit technologies. They inhabit us. We're collectively human in our ability to shape technologies for one another, building on the human history of tools. As an artist, I think my practice is kind of simply defined. Most everything I've been kind of alluding to. I have very simple dreams that I earnestly define as a desire to gather all the people I love in one place and the exploration of how the internet might be the infrastructure to be that place. I'm interested in shaping worlds that allow the people I love to build the worlds they need, which brings in the question of tools and how extensible the visions we set are, or are they too closed for people to borrow from, to live between, to really inhabit and dwell from? I think the third is really at the core to make the act of creation ubiquitous. And I mean, even. I don't know if ubiquity in the current sense of it is sufficient. I mean, we are surrounded with technologies, invisible, visible, but unevenly so. Question is, if we all become gods, is anyone? Our time is domineered by prescriptive technologies. I now invoke another Ursula Franklin, in which we read the world of production today as concerned by performance instead of people being holistic stewards of the process of technology from beginning to end, of the making of a world from beginning to end. Much of us are simply components of constrained worlds that we don't necessarily dictate. We have become mere specialists of select parts, often operating to where extant systems have placed us. I also use the term technologist intentionally because of how it may be defined so loosely. While we may easily envision the software engineer, I think technologists are any people who regularly interface with and enable technologies, right? The definition is broad even when we constrain technology to that of the modern machine. I think about the technologist who conducts the manual labor needed to maintain the vastness of infrastructure needed to power modern networks. The technologists who fashion together the materials of the machines you and I use and hold today, the technologists who process the natural materials necessary to begin creating these components. The young technologist I was when I was sitting down in front of a computer, I did not build to attempt to create an identity for myself on a server I did not host myself or did not really understand how it operated, and every being in between. Perhaps the machine is nature itself, and computers are made by fools like me. This rise in prescriptive technologies necessitates an era of surveillance, the cultures of a factory, compliance, machinic process. We see this breaking down before our very eyes. The production chains become fragile as undervalued laborers that are in truth essential, yet ultimately powerless components of large systems are pushed to the limits. In history, which we can always look to, we have the gendered labor of machines itself, where previously what was read as feminine was undervalued, from the era of pre-electronic computation exploiting highly educated women as cheap computational laborers, from again the myth of high technologies against the low, constantly perpetuating this practice of distancing the human from the technology. Who dictates intelligences anyway? Maybe we have never really stopped reading people as machines. This extends to technologies of governance, where we think that the slow and bureaucratic system must be reworked, and rightfully so. We continuously theorize about the power of the commons, invest in more localized forms of government, rethink civic participation, constantly facing the difficulties that come with scale, simply how human these technologies really are. The emergent narratives are very rarely matching to the dream of clean machinic technologies. In these conditions, the complexity of human problems are a bit less opaque. We know that band-aids don't solve systems, perhaps because the targeted components, here people and how they commune with one another, are seen for their fragility, that is, their humanity, all their softness. I think prescriptive technologies once encouraged us to think of people as machines, not technologies, but productive artifacts. Later, machines themselves became the objects of control instead of people. People are beings of faith, after all, in all their chaos and uncertainty. Machines are controllable, routine. Thereby begins the unending argument, the distinction between the mechanization of the self, where we tread between regarding ourselves as digital physical beings. I'm sure in the succeeding talks, many with decades of thought and work over me will expound on this, how intelligence says, how machines are again being redefined, how our relationships with them are emerging, changing forevermore. I think the contentious myth that was shared to me as this small person in the Philippines not knowing what went into technology, what the pipeline looked like, not knowing what FANG was that certain humans would be safe from the ongoing waves of revolution, as long as he participated in the making. But the new divine is already here, and the push of these dominances, of the dominance of prescriptive technologies, has constantly led to these feelings of powerlessness, at worst, false agency that I warn against. And I think when we feel distance from technology, we are subsequently distanced from each other. So I'm thinking, how easily can we identify the beginnings of the many worlds we live in today? What is invisible? In which of these beginnings do we even take part in dictating? Perhaps our labor, resource, and land shape these cosmologies, but which dominant systems of belief accurately pay respect to the power of people? And which methods of belief can we begin imbuing power towards and moving towards? This is the alternate worlds that we're all reaching towards, scrambling to see, to live in. What I warn against is that even in the colloquial reading of technologists, this is the privileged, well-educated software engineer. They have always been and are atomized. They are no exemption to this time of prescriptive technologies. The value of computational labor has always been redefined by who is powerful. Particular myths of technology once favored the software engineer until alternate ones were posited, and the world again was made and unmade, made and unmade. The model technologist was never exempt, perhaps because they were never able to exert control over the entirety of the making of a technology, over the entirety of the making of a world in the first place. I hinted at this through the mentionings of infrastructure, corporations, servers, where we are actually building on top of. All to say that we have been lulled into the myth of technology, where creation alone is power. When creation inhabited and extended upon, and how this is actually lived through, and how this is actually realized, and how this is actually extended, must have some shared story. I'm thinking about this in the context of me even being here, speaking here. I live as an exception to the norm. If it was true that access to technology was so ubiquitous, why still is my story an exemption from the 100 million people who live in the Philippines? While machines are ubiquitous, the myths entrusted to people and the narratives they are able to live out are dispensed radically differently. The real interfacing with technology for many in the Philippines is the one underscored by this time of revisionism, this time of surveillance, of false networks of knowledge that only subscribe people to further systems of control, rather than giving them control over a plurality of worlds that not only they can choose, they can actually shape and inhabit it. Even those privileged, I think, to benefit from the class mobility afforded by working with computers, working with machines, working with whatever is favored today, often never get to dictate, again, the structural workings of these systems in the first place. Part of this is because the labor from the global south is largely undervalued. These human intelligences marketed constantly as cheap but efficient labor, my people often reduced to virtual assistants, cheap software engineering work, rather than visionaries. They do not have the credentials, they do not have the markers of prestige, even if they have the experience, even if they have all the means to imagine alternate worlds. They take no part in forging these mythologies, only realizing another's. I think the widespread practice of programming as we know it today was never widely taught of or respected as an artisan craft, even though I know many of us are working towards changing that, even when it always should have been. Those who control systems of power, those who control what is naturalized, are always threatened by the multiplicities of godliness. Our technologies today are designed to appear as magic. Ideal design is invisible, out of sight, embedded, unknown. These atomized systems are represented to us with their workings and human interdependencies obscured. Under the hood, what appears magical is just what is profoundly human. Many technologies propose that we are key in their shaping and then take us away, that without our intelligences and constant intervention in their process, they would be nothing. But then again, all the human-built components, materials, words that power them become solely machinic. The humanity and the technology rendered away. The human and machine have become so entwined that as the machine is obscured, so is the human. The new creation myth purports that the human was never necessary in the first place. Instead of a complex interdependency that is celebrated, we have regressed to this subject of faith being that of the soul machine. The creator, then, the one who has power, hides behind the machine, behind the ominous narrative of the human being unnecessary, we have forgotten how fundamentally human technology is. And behind the suggestion of the erasure of the human was the human. So it goes that the making of any mythology is intertwined with the question of power. The mythologist, technologist is the figure of power who is able to not only determine what future narratives are possible and therefore what can be built, but what the society deems as natural, what we can buy into, what is worth investing in. We already made and will continue to be unmade and remade again and again. But naturalization is powerful. What is regarded as environmental or natural becomes the basis of our being, what we revere from nature, the inexplicable, what becomes the person. Mythology has naturalized certain ways of looking and being within the world. I think the most powerful mythologists, technologists are not only the visionaries of the future, but those who especially have already seized control of present ways of being. It is in these people who influence what alternatives to the present we might imagine, or those who question if we even want alternatives. Our present friction with the technological creation myth is that we have ironically abolished the complexity of human acts. We have abolished the attribution of technologies from speech to word to the computer as a factor of human interrelations and conditioning. We have abolished the human, the most critical factor of technology. It is in this way that mythology itself is at odds with humanity. This is the remaking of a myth. Another reality that we're living within is that computational power afforded to us today has accelerated this work of narrativization of who gets to write the stories and narratives that we live in. This is why the question of power is so pertinent. In this flood of possibilities, power constrains these inhabited possibilities. But we live where the revolution is every day, where people are rewriting and writing life as we know it. When do we get to live? This is why we turn to myth. There are so many readings of the world now. We have long evolved from a time of being, taking generations to pass down. Instead, new forms of speech, that is, myth making, are transmitted and adopted instantaneously. Our ways of identifying with new digital norms have barely caught up. The nature of modern technologies to render time and space irrelevant, a mass forgetting or rewriting of history, material, and infrastructure needed to maintain technologies, nurture these misreadings. The narratives that back these mythologies are often myopic. The ways of living they suggest to us are often just as insular. How do we live? Worlds are emerging at faster than ever rates. They are experienced in rapid life cycles. They are coming and going, living and dying. We find ourselves at the crossroads of multiple intersecting worlds drawn by technological lines. And again, what is natural determines what worlds people choose. As such, our worlds become unevenly inhabited. We might be satisfied with these microcosms, these little bits of lore that we find in small worlds, in the retreat from the larger world that we have tried again to distance ourselves from. But this never solves this larger structural problem of the shared worlds that we live in, that we operate within, that we all commune with each other in. It's not enough to only select the communities we need when there are so many people marginalized who never get to see these possibilities. We also realize that with accelerated narrativization comes the fact that technologies have always functioned as tools that let us redefine problems. The complexities of the world have always been reduced into these specific narratives. In modern times, the relationship of tooling and godhood has existed and more of a thrash than ever. These component objects that allow us to access creation are easier to access than ever. And we're constantly misguided into thinking that total godhood is attainable. The myth of the technologist god falsely imbues power into creation, solely into creation, which is only one aspect into the grand scheme of things. As myth making, subsequently, faith is mostly determined by power. We are constantly stacking technological solutions onto problems started by human technologies themselves. Problem solving has become somewhat of a formula optimized for scale or profit, rather than a regenerative, intentional process that mends with extant systems more consciously. Computational complexity is favored over understanding human complexity. After all, computers are predictable, people are not. And again, what was all of this for? What is a multiplicity of worlds able to afford us when ones we choose are constantly dying, when we are not able to share them, when I can gather the people I love in one place, but not extend this option to the others? I'm concerned with creation myths for alternative imaginaries, but especially marginalized nows. I think that in truth, much of the making of a world is simply giving a name to it. That there are many existing worlds that we must draw from, and the biggest question is how these worlds are affirmed and inhabited. If the modern myth is built to take away humanity, how we dwell, how we shape, the intentions of our making, what is there? It is no surprise that we have forgotten the human. It is no surprise that we're constantly making ends of ourselves. We're now I'm thinking about how we can construct creation myths. What are alternative ways of determining these features? When I say that I want to create, I must first world. To world, I must first mythologize. I plant belief where there was none, and then I make it. I'm imagining a world in 3 steps, where technology is rehumanized, where the human is technology, technology is human. This means that this is completely visible. We are recentered onto the human, technology and all its labor, love, liberty, fragility, softness. We learn from communities and the natural, resilient ways of being that have made their own histories, that have struggled to contend with the dominant narratives. We learn about conscious ways of being that respect the complexities of our ecologies. That is, if there's a new world to be made, it must begin from the narratives of those who have long been in the practice of dwelling. Our dreams of radical restructuring must be rooted in the people who have always been violently silenced, who have never had the options to make these worlds in the first place. Only then there may be reinvention. I dream of a world where technologists understand their power as myth makers, that this is inherent to the role, that a true technologist has this in the role, that the narrative is above the artifact produces the self that then lives through these narratives. We who tell and shape stories must make visible our intentions, make visible our humanity. We extend these foundations beyond ourselves. Every act of creation is inherently environmental. We recognize technology's ability to not only shape material, but to expand our consciousness of what is possible. If we shape worlds, we know that coupled with that is our pertinent role as a mythologist. It is in the narratives we tell of technology, of what we promise to each other, of what we might choose to erase, that birth what people are able to live through. It is the stories we tell and the tools that we make that come from it to support these, that life actually emerges. And I retreat again to the simple dream of wishing that everyone becomes a technologist, the dream of ubiquity, where systemic evening of making redefines the power embedded in access to infrastructure and tools, where our ways of communicating and adopting with technology are reinvented. And again, the marginalized makers are able to invoke their lived and buried experiences, that the politics and powers of control and access inherent to technology are even. We realize that it's not the machines that need changing, but ourselves. Blind faith is distributed. Everyone has the gift of necessary delusion to make. Everyone makes and unmakes themselves. Everyone has this gift. We are beyond systems. When everyone is a technologist, we might move towards a world where the notion of God, where the notion of magic, the notion of mythology themselves are altered, redefined. There are no gods, just people and machines. What is technology but the presentation of a new narrative for us to live through? What is technology but a mode of materializing imaginaries? What is technology but belief in each other? What do we have but each other? When I imagine a future of computing, I think of the role of technology in enabling people to construct their own narratives in all its tenderness, in all the history we owe to each other, of each other. Our primary interest becomes that of the human story, where technology, even if invisible, is synonymous with the human act of belief. One where technologies are ubiquitous enough for everyone to partake in shaping, where every technologist understands that inherent to their role is this act of mythologization. I don't know how to pronounce words anymore. At the end of the world, the human story will live where we may no longer. The computer is reduced to rocks, all objects that contain the history of us, language and writing and tools and cloth and machine will all be remade, perhaps in newer form, never quite the same as how they were today. What is of certainty is that again, man will be loved, be sheltered, be fed, be held, be able to make when they would like to make. And when they were not able to make today, what they were not able to make today, they will lay the grounds for the next man to make through tools, through technologies. It is only in the creation myth that the story of us will be recovered, the most precious conclusion that might be drawn from us, that might be drawn from what these objects we artifact, from what these technologies we artifact ultimately guide us towards, is just one simple truth, that everything began from faith in one another. Thank you. That's the end.